Welcome, everybody. I'm clinical psychologist Dr. Steve Thayer, and this is Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and mental health. My co-host is Dr. Reid Robison. Reid is a psychiatrist and a seasoned psychedelic researcher and clinician. Today, Reid and I are joined by Vhari Macbeth. Vhari is a clinical social worker with extensive experience as a therapist working with ketamine to treat a number of mental health conditions. In this episode, we explore the concept of the self. We discuss what the self is, the multiplicity of selves within all of us, what psychedelics can teach us about the self, the potential value of self-disillusion experienced on psychedelics, the importance of self-integration, especially after a psychedelic experience, pathological self-concepts, meaning and purpose as it relates to the self, and much, much more. Please enjoy. Okay, today we're going to tackle something light. Not too much to digest for our audience. We're going to talk about the self, a topic that I'm sure no one in history has given much thought. We're going to solve it. We're going to answer all the questions today. But this idea of like who we are, what is consciousness, and how does it go awry is foundational to psychology, foundational to the way we think about mental illness and how we go about helping other people. And we certainly do a lot of exploring with the self when we try to approach mental health with using these psychedelic tools. So I'm going to pass it on to you guys. Thoughts and concepts around the self.
So something when you were talking about how important it was for you in your college days to figure out what the self is, I was wondering, what do you think drove that? Why was it so important to you to figure that out?
Steve's search for meaning.
Yeah. And this was something we were talking about before we started recording. But yeah, when I was in college, it was really important for me to know sort of what the truth was, capital T truth. I was raised in a fairly conservative religion that had the answers for me, and never had much cause to doubt those answers until later in life when I was learning that things seemed a little bit more complicated than I had always assumed. And it was just really, it's hard to describe why, but really important for me to understand the nature of the mind, to understand the nature of reality, so that I knew what I was thinking, the decisions that I was making were correct. Like I had a really hard time with ambiguity and a really hard time with making mistakes, and especially in my early 20s. So yeah, I started studying a lot about the self and about the mind, and it's what really got me into psychology. Generally. Didn't find any of the answer, or at least not the concrete answers I was hoping for.
Yeah. Maybe there's just more questions.
Yeah.
Where does your search for self date back to, Vhari?
I think for me, like any curiosity or questions I have is always like comes from that place of curiosity first, but then always wanting to be like, how can this help me, or how can this help someone else? And so when I like try and think about the self, what's important to me in answering those questions is when we're able to know what's important, then we can maybe get healing or move on from unhealthy ways of living or coping.
Yeah, and I'll throw in confession that I think, personally and in most other people, that search for meaning and self comes from a place of anxiety as well.
Yeah.
Like, in fact, if you dig into the neurobiological underpinnings of what is the self, like the self with the lowercase s, not the capital S supreme self, it's a bundle of nerves and pathways, sure, like the default mode network, sure. But where does it come from and why? It's like an effort to predict what's going to happen in a way. Like there's this hierarchical predictive coding like that we wire and modify as we go due to the uncertainty that is not only uncomfortable, but it develops in part for our survival as a species. Like there was a Zen teacher who what he said struck me once. when someone asked, how much ego do you need? Just enough so you don't get hit by a bus. But you need a little bit.
Right.
Yeah.
So now you're making me think of the evolutionary underpinnings or roots of self-awareness.
Yeah.
Like when did we in this evolutionary timeline, when did we get the capacity to look back at the looker, to say, oh, I'm thinking about something, and other people might be thinking about it differently. My perception might be off. Like, I wonder when theory of mind happened, and if we're looking at it from an evolutionary lens, it was selected for and made us arguably the dominant species on the planet. There's obviously something useful, and maybe not getting hit by a bus is a good way to describe it.
Or was it when the monkeys ate the mushroom?
Right.
Yeah, could have been that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
with the anxiety thing, I remember even being really young and being so afraid of losing my sense of self or hallucinating or becoming schizophrenic. And it was this huge panic for me that I might lose myself and I think a big part of that is because it's almost like when you lose that sense of self, you lose community around you, you lose that connection with everyone else, and that is so frightening.
Yeah, just like death is frightening.
Yeah.
But the psychosis tidbit is interesting because I've always been intrigued by the fact that there are some similarities between the psychotic state and the psychedelic state, right? But there are some differences in outcome. Like, you don't surrender into psychosis. It's just why I think they're not the same in the end, or there's not the same result, is we don't say, oh, just like give into your schizophrenia, go for it. Like, we fight it. But in the psychedelic experience, the number one intention people go in with is like surrender. You go completely there so you can kind of relax, dissolve that little s self, get into the big S self, and then come out with a new perspective. And if you look at even outside of the realm of plant medicines and psychedelics, the traditional shamanic path is often one of psychosis and emerging from that, like a phoenix from the ashes, or with this access to things beyond the little s self.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you see that come up in a lot of Jung's work and the hero's journey. That there's something valuable and universal in the human spirit about having to pass through a crucible, having to pass through the dark night of the soul. And there's something to be learned about the soul by experiencing its loss or experiencing its shadow, and then coming out on the other side enlightened or better. And when you think of it therapeutically, that in a way psychedelics and other things provide for people that experience.
A death experience, essentially.
Yeah.
And so you can be reborn. Like, you have to lose yourself to find yourself. Right. You know what helped me kind of see this from a new perspective is when, the Buddhist and the Hindu approaches, but it was especially when I dove in deep to yoga and yoga philosophy. There's this idea that we're all part of this ocean of consciousness, and just like the ocean has waves that look like unique individual things, but they're not. They're really part of this greater ocean. And in some of the Vedic texts, like the Yoga Sutras, there's one that says the seeker becomes the seer. On your path to self-realization, eventually there's this point where something switches and you realize that you're not on a path, you are the path. Or like, we all are made of the same stuff. We are all one. And so much of our suffering, so much of our conflict comes from the fact that we've forgotten that.
Yeah. So that's an interesting idea. Do you think you can be one if there isn't a self? Like, there aren't individual selves to become one together? Like, is that part of it? Like, do you need to have a self in order to join selves and be one? Like, is there an important part of being an individual as well as oneness?
I think, your question begs a lot of other questions, I think. Like, when we're talking about being one, you could talk about it from a lot of different perspectives. One with the universe, one with a concept like purpose and meaning, or our fractured selves being unified in purpose, or at least well mitigated through the capital S self. Mm-hmm. So that's a fancy way of saying I don't know.
Yeah. I just know that when I have felt most one with those around me, it's when I'd say my fake self has been completely dissolved, and I'm just my true essence, and they are too. And there is that connection between us and love between us. And I feel like having, this unique thing that you are mixed with the unique thing that they are, and joining that together and being together in your uniqueness and yet oneness is where that nirvana experience is. And if I don't exist anymore as an entity, does it even matter that I'm joining up with someone? Because I don't even have the sense of what it was to be separate. I don't know. It just...
These are mind-bending questions, but I do. I mean, this is just my belief and not something that I can prove. But I do believe that you can coexist in those two planes or realms of form and formless. And in fact, that's kind of the goal of all of this. The contemplative practices, the spiritual path, the psychedelic experience to get you on that path is so that you can remember your unity, your oneness, that God inside each of us, and then bring that into day-to-day life, like the Buddhist saying, before enlightenment, chop, carry wood. After enlightenment, chop, carry wood. You come back and you do your thing. Or Jack Kornfield says, after ecstasy, the laundry. You still got to do it, but you can remember your true nature.
Yeah.
After ecstasy, the laundry. Sometimes when my clients have important insights that seem to carry with them capital S self energy, like they seem very present and compassionate and curious, I'll say to them, drop a breadcrumb right here, and on your way out of it, leave a trail, because eventually you're not going to feel like you feel right now. You're going to get home, your partner will say something triggering, you'll be back into anger, you'll get defensive. And that's okay. That's, for whatever reason, the nature of the human mind, nature of human consciousness. And so what is mental health and what is self-care or working on oneself, if not following the breadcrumbs back and having practices that help you see the crumbs and follow them back. Practices like meditation or yoga or exercise, or sometimes it's medicine, sometimes it's being in nature, breathing practices. Like, there's lots of different ways human beings have used to find the path back, but it's hard to do it if you've never been there.
Yeah.
Right? If you haven't had an opportunity to drop the crumbs, it's hard to follow the path back.
Yeah, it shows you the way, it opens the gates, the portals. But I like that, the breadcrumb analogy. In retreat settings, whether it's ayahuasca internationally or even ketamine-assisted psychotherapy retreats here, often at the end, we'll have the client, the group, build a castle around that experience, like store it away in a special sacred way so you know where to go. Even with our music in the ketamine room, like, we'll often tell people, use a special playlist, save it, and revisit it for one tiny way of many that you can reaccess that transpersonal state, that spiritual self.
Yeah, I had a client who, at the peak of his medicine experience, happened to be listening to this one Imagine Dragons song.
Yeah.
And it was a song that was unremarkable to him before, but now he's used that as a lodestone, as something to draw him back to that place when he listens to it. And he doesn't want to over-listen it. He doesn't want to, radio kill it so that it's no longer meaningful to him. So he saves it for those times when he needs to get back into that consciousness.
Yeah. There must be something really important about the ordinary and then the extraordinary of a psychedelic experience, because most of us or when they give a psychedelic an option for a mouse or a rat, whatever, they only push it once. That's it. And it's not like most of us have that experience and every day we're just hooked up to a psychedelic experience. I mean, there must be something important in coming back to this very ordinary laundry doing realm. And but then also having those extraordinary experiences to inform the ordinary.
I think they're initiation tools. Like they help you see, remember, get on the path, and then like Alan Watts said, when you get the message, hang up the phone. I think the reason why for many people, the more psychedelics you do over time, they start to lose their potency in a way. Like they become less and less game-changing for your life if you're just doing them all the time, versus when your mind and your heart was blown wide open the first time.
Right.
Yeah.
Because I think they get you on the path. They're initiatory experiences.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Do you think you have to have that ego death where you no longer remember your name, you have no sense of self in order to get to that place of I don't know, the epitome of what a psychedelic experience is supposed to be and do for you?
Yeah, I don't think so. I think even if you catch a little glimpse, like you see a speck of light at the end of the tunnel, you know where to go. And then the real work is after ecstasy, right? And I think you can get a glimmer of that samadhi, nirvana state, or that transpersonal experience, or you can get kind of blasted into it, lose yourself entirely. And that, I think that has some other benefits in terms of like relaxing those tightly held prior beliefs, letting you move forward with a blank slate. But I don't think you need it.
Yeah.
I was listening to Jamie Wheal talk about, he wrote Stealing Fire. He's he's coming out with a new book on some of these topics, but he's kind of famous / infamous for being critical of this social scene that's developing around this new psychedelic renaissance, and then the spiritual bypasses that are happening. But people sort of getting addicted, quote unquote, to ecstasis, to the ecstasy given by ego loss, or being in the realm of the enlightened, and not coming back and doing the laundry. What maybe we would call integration, because you're not always the ocean. Most of the time you're the wave, and the wave is what exists in your life, and maybe you're not doing yourself or your community or your family or whatever any favors if you are always off in enlightened land. Yeah. So when I think about helping people with psychedelics, you want to provide for them the experience, and it's powerful, often involves an obliteration of the ego, provides for them these great insights. But maybe what's most important is the metabolization and integration of the insights.
Yeah, I agree.
Not easy, but...
Well, and it's not always a ecstatic experience either. Sometimes it's hard and scary, and those are important too. Maybe more important? I don't know.
I think so. And in the psilocybin literature, they look at this is out of Imperial College, but they'll look at the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, the MEQ30, and something they developed called the Emotional Breakthrough Inventory, and showed that the lasting change is more likely to occur when you have a high mystical experience and you have a high score on the emotional breakthrough. I mean, you faced the dark night of the soul, you made it through the other side, you came out changed, returned with gifts in the hero's journey. And we've measured that in ayahuasca retreats, in the ketamine room countless times, and I believe it holds true. Even the Humphrey Osmond story of when he was sitting there with Nate Hoffer, another psychiatrist, half joking, say maybe we should give LSD to individuals with alcoholism and make them psychotic, because LSD kind of does that, and because when an individual with alcoholism has delirium, they tend to recover more, because that was a terrifying experience. But he's like, what if we can occasion that? And then the more they thought about it, they were like, yeah, there might be something to it, and there was. They gave it to thousands of people and showed way better recovery rates.
Yeah, it was kind of like inducing the rock bottom that that people hit. I seem to remember from that story that somebody else told them, there was like a third person involved that said, yeah, but maybe add some love to it too. Because I read about it recently and I can't remember exactly.
Yeah, it's like in the schizophrenia thing, you can't surrender and let go to lose yourself completely and then find yourself without someone holding safe space or providing that loving, supporting presence or that hand to pull you out of the abyss if you need it,
Yeah. Well, and with addictions, I feel like, just from my own personal philosophy, it's just a way to avoid facing things that are so painful a lot of times. And so if you go in and you face those head on, why would you need the alcohol anymore? You already did the thing that you never wanted to do, that you kept avoiding by numbing, and you just did it. So now you're not afraid of it anymore.
I think addiction is a really good lens to look at self through. Like I've heard Gabor Mate say, when you're addressing an addiction, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. Kind of like you were saying.
Yeah.
Like what is this person trying to soothe, to address, to hide, to run from with their addictive behavior? And if you've ever had the experience of sort of arguing with yourself, then you know what it's like to have multiple selves. Like my morning self was super motivated, exercised, made plans for what my evening self was going to do, right? My morning self had plans for my evening self to read and stretch and pray and meditate and be magnanimous to my children. But instead, my evening self just watched YouTube for 3 hours and stayed up too late, So this multiplicity of selves is something I've been thinking about a lot lately as I've been introduced to internal family systems, a therapeutic approach that is often used in some of these research projects that are being done on psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and also James Fadiman's book, The Symphony of Selves, which I'm about halfway through. And it's a comforting way for me to think about how self-defeating we can be. It's less confusing to me because it's like, oh, I'm self-defeating because I've got more than one self, and sometimes they're at odds.
And they showed up for a reason. Like one of those selves showed up after a wound to protect you from that wound getting touched again.
Right.
Like a behavior that numbs you out from the pain that you didn't have the resources to handle at the time. So then it was like a defense. And the thing about healing our multiple selves or reintegrating those is, you can't do it by fighting with them, or you can't bring your exiled self back by yelling at it, right? It's a loving approach to thank you for what you did to protect me at a time that I really needed it, but we're okay now, We got this together in a more conscious way.
Yeah, and how important those like disgusting or shameful parts are, that that even though there's things that maybe we don't want anyone else to see and we want to hide, that they do so much good, and we need all of it. We need the ones that everyone likes to see and the ones that we don't want anyone to see. Like, they are all of us, and they all play a role and do something good for us.
Yeah, we need all of it, right? We need the whole system. And we need them to be healthy. We need them to be in harmony. Like we need not to be cacophonous in there. We need them to be synced up. In order to do that, as I'm thinking about what you said, Reid, there needs to be a culture of compassion and love, not one of criticism or judgment or harshness or rejection. So I'm thinking about the yin yang, the balance of the quote unquote masculine and feminine energies. They serve different roles, and if one is too dominant, then the system isn't healthy. But if they're in balance and harmony, then things work out better.
Yeah, I see. I think it's because I heard Dick Schwartz, who created IFS, say it once, is that the selves, the parts that we all have inside of us or that make up our bigger multiplicity of selves, you can see them as like individuals sitting around a conference table, and they could be bickering, battling, or they could be working harmoniously. And you're going to get a lot more done if there's harmony and peace and respect amongst yourselves.
Right. And in order to get that, you got to understand where the other selves are coming from. Like I'm thinking about a married couple that's arguing. A lot of times the argument isn't about what they're talking about. It's about the stories behind the conflict. And so maybe you approach your own selves in a similar way. Like this particular self is showing up. It's making me want to feel and do X, Y, or Z, but maybe like you were referring to earlier, Reid, it's there for these other reasons. And I need to understand and give compassion to those other reasons in order for it to calm down and retreat and be agreeable.
And it's interesting in IFS because there is a lot of pre-work that needs to be done, that you have this bigger capital S self that is well developed, that can be there to support all of these other small S's. And so even in IFS, there's this idea of there being a true self or
a higher self.
A higher self, yeah.
And it has certain qualities in Schwartz. I think it's like the 8 C's, compassion and I'm like,
calm,
remember, curious.
Yeah. Which are a lot of the things that one gets out of a psychedelic experience, which is interesting too. So maybe it's not a dissolving of yourself. Maybe it's a stripping down to that true self, to that self that, you know, with religious beliefs that you hope that higher being sees in you and that you try to get to too.
Or that is the higher being, right? It's God consciousness.
Yeah.
It's if there's an organizing energy or a deity or whatever, that's the stuff that it's made of.
Yeah. And maybe we've just personified that into a religious figure, but it is that internal.
And even in the religions where it is personified, you know, Jesus will still say, like, the kingdom of God is within you. You know, I think that's a common theme to the religious schools of thought that are all seeking, they're all different paths up this same mountain or path to that supreme self, God consciousness, ultimate truth.
So I wanted to read a small excerpt from an introduction to internal family systems model.
Would you like us to scoot up and get on the rug with
I'm
you?
going to show it to you like a school librarian.
Oh, thank you. And make sure you go like this so we can all see it.
I'll read it my best narration voice. So this is an excerpt from The Velveteen Rabbit that Schwartz includes in the book. So, what is real? Asked the rabbit one day. Does it happen all at once or bit by bit? It doesn't happen all at once, said the skin horse. You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't often happen to people who break easily, or who have sharp edges, or who have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off, and your eyes drop out, and you get loose in the joints and very shabby. But these things don't matter at all, because once you're real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand. And the word real is capitalized each time they say it. Once you're real, you can't be ugly, except to people who don't understand. There's a kind of felt, experienced knowing. When you have had the experience of God consciousness or self, or the things we've been talking about, that when somebody else has had that experience and you start talking to somebody else about it, there's like like you know what this feels like. Either you've achieved it through prayer or meditation or psychedelics or whatever it is, suffering. And I see you, kind of like you were talking about earlier, Vhari, you feel best when you can be undefended and completely authentically you. There's something so beautiful about being with somebody who exemplifies that, and being a person who can exemplify that, because you can't be despicable. You can't be ugly, even if you're being obnoxious or bad, because nothing human is disgusting if it's understood. I heard a what are they called? Plastic surgeon. He was on one of those like really gross shows where it's like, extreme makeovers. We're going to, resculpt your entire face and body. I heard him say, when someone was complaining about the way that they looked, because this guy was going to restructure the way that they looked, like, oh yeah, and this part about me is so disgusting. And he said, nothing human is disgusting. And I thought it was beautiful, if not ironic, coming from a plastic surgeon who changes and alters all those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that quote. It's so true. You can't really unsee it once you've seen it. I mean, you can forget, where you're going to stumble and
get distracted.
Yeah, it is a continual practice, but it can be a radical change in perspective where you forever see the world in a different way, whether it's a psychedelic experience or some profound mystical experience in kind of religious or contemplative practices, or even out of the blue.
Yeah. Any other profound thoughts? Or they don't have to be profound.
Non-profound.
Well, we don't have enough time.
I'll
for
take
all
of Vhari's
all
profound
of my
thoughts.
profound thoughts.
So one story comes to mind to end with that relates to psychedelics and the self, I think. But this isn't my story. It's a Ram Dass story. But and I've been geeking out on his stories lately. Is he was doing an LSD experiment once, and he timed it wrong. So it was actually peaking by the time his Sunday family lunch occurred. So he goes to this, and he's at the peak of a high-dose LSD session, where to the point where the faces of his family were animals, right? So, but he knows how to navigate his psychedelic experience by then. So he sits down at the dinner table, and his brother, who they have this feisty relationship, his brother is poking fun at him the same way he normally would, or like, how's your psychology work, or just making fun of things. And he'd normally react when he's in his egoic self. But in this state, he saw the brother's words, who's got this animal face, coming at him like arrows in slow motion, and then he'd just pick them up and set them down next to his fork and spoon.
Wow.
And then his response in this place he'd sunk into beyond the ego, where he could feel that oneness and love, he would reply with loving things like, your family is so beautiful, or like, I really love this about you. And then he would see these hearts going back and hitting his brother in the face. And then that started to spread through the family dinner to the point where afterwards, even the next day, they were like calling each other saying, wasn't that the best family gathering ever? Don't we have the most amazing family? And that didn't normally occur. And so he called that shifting the game through psychedelics, or all these other paths we're talking about.
Yeah, paths that generate awareness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and kind of back to where I started, of how I had this like deep fear of losing myself, and then realizing that there's nothing to be afraid of. Maybe that's to be embraced. And I remember having a moment of that. We have a history of Alzheimer's in my family, and I'd always looked at Alzheimer's as this horrible thing, and how it's so important to check in with that person, ask them what date it is, keep them here and now. And I remembered listening to this NPR thing where there was this man who he was taking care of his mom, and he just kept trying to do that, kept trying to bring her down to reality, to where he was. And then he was like, why am I doing this? And then he just joined her where she was, and he was like, we had so much fun. It was magical. She was no longer frustrated. And so he thought he knew what was best. He thought that reality was what was best, and really he was so wrong. And I think that's the greatest thing about psychedelics and about those experiences that make us change our whole way of looking at everything, and including looking at ourselves, what we're afraid of, what's important, and who we are.
Yeah.
For sure.
Yeah, beautiful.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us today. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Novamind, a mental health company that specializes in psychedelic medicine and research. You can learn more about Novamind's mission to increase access to legal, safe, and evidence-based psychedelic medicine at novamind.ca. If you like what you heard today, please subscribe to the podcast on whatever platform you're using to listen or watch. Also, if you're feeling generous today, please leave us a glowing review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. This will help us get into the ears and faces of more people and help us put wind in the sails of the psychedelic medicine renaissance. Thanks for listening.